So this morning, as I was thinking about it, I just got back from winter camp with the students. And so a lot of what we talked at winter camp has been on my mind. And then also I'm getting ready to start teaching in Hebrews on Wednesday nights again. So they've been kind of mixing in my mind. And I thought, you know what, this might be a great opportunity to use you guys as a think tank. Not really, but just go through kind of what I've been thinking of, how they connect, how what we learned up at camp is relevant in Hebrews, how it shines through, and what the author of Hebrews is talking about. So I'll jump around a little bit, but if you want a place to stay, go to Hebrews 4, verses 14 to 16. And then we'll talk a little bit about in chapter 6 too. But so what we're going to be talking about this morning is this correlation. So at camp, what we talked about is walking this life. And the camp speaker, which was another youth pastor at another church, he was using the format of the Pilgrim's Progress for it. How many of you have read the Pilgrim's Progress? So the idea of the Pilgrim's Progress is there's this pilgrim who's Christian, and he is walking life. And then there's all these things that he encounters. There's warnings, pitfalls, and it's supposed to emulate like the things we encounter as Christians on our walk through life. And there's also helpers, and so he talked about those things and how it models what a Christian life would look like. And then we also had other sessions where the other youth pastors were able to speak more specifically and practically on things of the Christian life. And one thing that came around to was two people in particular were talking about what is truth and how do we trust God. And those two things are actually very connected. So when we come to Hebrews, in Hebrews he's talking about a lot of things. And the verse that we're going to look at, he's talking a lot about the salvation that we have, specifically in Jesus, and how because of who Jesus is, we can have confidence. And I'm going to connect that to the camp thing, because at camp we talked about truth and trusting God. And my question that we're going to walk through is, can we trust God? Or, I guess more specifically, do you live as if you do trust God? Because at camp, and I could do the whole process of going through all the scriptures, but one of the things the person talked about is what is truth, and ultimately, what is the answer to that question? God is truth, right? He is the foundation of truth. He is where we get all our truth from. That's why Chris, when he gets up on Sundays, he says, this should be your benchmark for truth, the Bible. And so, because God is truth, that's what makes him trustworthy. We can trust that what God says is true, and what he says is going to happen because we know God is truth, and he cannot lie. In Hebrews 6, verse 18, sorry, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. But he talks about the certainty of God's promise. And so in verse 17, when he says, so when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. Because God made this promise, and God cannot lie. And one of the things, I'm going to do an illustration. I normally don't do illustrations, but it's very helpful, especially when I'm speaking with youth. But this illustration is a person who is a tightrope walker, and he sets a tightrope all the way across Niagara Falls. And he has a whole group there watching him, and he like does it once or twice, and they're all cheering. Then he like, oh, how many of you think I can do it with a wheelbarrow? And they all raise their hand and start cheering, and so he goes across with the wheelbarrow doing it. And then he gets back, he's like, how many of you think I can do it with a person inside the wheelbarrow? And they all start cheering, saying, yeah, we think you can do it. And he's like, all right, who's going to get in the wheelbarrow? And then no one goes up. Because it's easy for them to cheer and be excited about that. It's another thing to actually, but to actually live out what you're saying you believe. Because they all were sitting there shouting, like, yeah, I believe you can walk across that with a person in your wheelbarrow. But did any of them believe it enough to actually walk it out? No. They wanted someone else to do it, right? And so when we say God is truth, and we say, yeah, we believe God is truth, he's trustworthy, the question that we challenge the students up at camp, and I want us to challenge us here going through Hebrews, is do we believe it? Do we actually walk as if that's true? Because it's one thing to say, yes, I believe this and that's true, and another thing to actually live that out. And we'll see that that's actually quite difficult for us, because it's a future promise that we don't see. So we're living as if something that we can't see is true, and that's where we get faith. But we're called to do it, right? God.
Say that again.
So we're looking forward to a future promise, right? And we'll see it here when we go through this passage. But we're looking to this forward promise that God has made, that because Christ died for our sins, and that because I believed in him, I am saved. And that means eternity with him. But we don't see that reality yet. It's something we can't see. It would be different if someone says, oh, if you pay me $15, I have this candy bar for you. I can see that. That's easier to believe and be confident to go into that. And so that's what I mean, it's something we can't see. It's a future hope. But we can have confidence and certainty that it's going to happen. And why is that? I've talked about it.
He used the truth as he said so.
Yeah, because God is truth, right? And he said so. So, let's go into the passage. Hebrews 4, verse 16, or verses 14 to 16. Ready Hebrews says, since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. So he says, since then, we have a great high priest. When he says since then, he's mentioning back to an argument he started back in chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. We won't go back there. But he's getting to a point. The argument he's been making is Jesus is a unique high priest. And he's one that's not like any of the other high priests. And he says it with how he says a great high priest. One, no other high priest was called great. That was a unique thing here. And then another thing is no other high priest has passed through the heavens. He says we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens. What does that mean to pass through the heavens?
And resurrected.
Resurrected, right? But more than that, because what happened after he got resurrected?
He ascended into heaven.
Yeah, he ascended into heaven and sat down, right? And a lot of times when we talk about the gospel, I think we forget that. We don't forget that part, but we don't emphasize it as much. But I think it's vitally important, especially for when we're talking about Jesus being our high priest, because what is the job of a high priest? Do we know?
Offer sacrifices.
Yeah. Specifically offering sacrifices on behalf of the people. They're the ones that would go and offer the atonement sacrifice. And they'd have to go behind the curtain into the holiest holies to do it, which was where they believed God dwelled. And so, Jesus going through the heavens into the very presence of God, where the high priest is supposed to do that, he's doing something no high priest before has ever been able to do. Also, he also says, heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, no other priest is the Son of God. So there's a special privileges that Jesus has that no other high priest has. So, when we think about this, when we're talking about Jesus as our high priest, he's no ordinary high priest. He's unique. And there's a reason why those unique things matter. And he ends that verse saying, let us hold fast our confession. What is our confession as Christians? And when I talked with the high schoolers about this, they got a little confused because they thought, like, what do we confess? Like, our sins? And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm talking about. Yeah, our faith. So what is the confession that we may have?
Jesus is Lord.
Jesus is Lord. Yeah. And when we say that, we both mean it in a historical sense and a faith sense, right? By using the name Jesus here, the writer of Hebrews is actually putting in the ground, like, our faith is in this historical figure named Jesus of Nazareth. So the ground for a believer's faith is that the one named great high priest and the Son of God is Jesus of Nazareth, the incarnation of God. That is one part of our confession. And then the second part is it refers to everything Christians have believed since the start of it all. Every confession to the gospel is what we've had since the beginning. In Romans 10, it makes up the heart of the Christian faith and what we have confessed throughout the centuries. And we can flip there if you want. But I will try to be quick about just going there real quick.
What was the reference, John?
Romans 10, verse 9. And it is because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And so, from the very beginning, throughout all history, every Christian, this has been the confession that we've all had. This is one thing we all have in common, is that this is our confession. This is what we believe in. And the writer of Hebrews is saying we need to hold fast to that. Christians believe and confess that Jesus Christ is the resurrected Lord. Now, as we go into the next verse, thinking about our confession, the writer of Hebrews continues saying, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. There are some people who think There are people along the lines that think Jesus could never know temptation the way that we do. And in part, this is true because Jesus faced temptation much more severely than we ever could. So, in a way, Jesus has faced temptation that we could never face. And that the reason for that is because he never gave in to it. And we know the longer you resist temptation, the stronger it builds. And Jesus, having never given into it, he knows the full strength of temptation. But that means Jesus can sympathize with our human weakness in temptation. But it's important to recognize he can sympathize with our temptation, but he'll never be able to sympathize with our sin, which is good. There might be some crazy people out there who says, well, why would that? It would be good if he would be able to sympathize with our sin. Well, I have a quote from Spurgeon saying why that would be a terrible thing. And he says, for sin is always a hardening nature. If Christ of God could have sinned, he would have lost the perfect part of his sympathetic nature. I think it's important for us to recognize sin hardens our heart and actually makes it harder for us to sympathize with others. So if Jesus experienced any of it, it'd make him less sympathetic. And so that argument in general is just crazy talk. But I think it's important. One thing that we can learn from that is if we're finding that we're having a hard heart towards others, it's a time that we should probably start being introspective. Like, where is this hardness of my heart coming from? Because normally it's from sin. It's not always the case, but that is generally the case. But because he is sinless, he can sympathize. This distinguishes temptation from sin, clearly, and we know when a line is crossed and a thought of temptation is allowed and turns over into sinful thought. So I could go longer into this. I won't this morning. But it's the idea of like, a lot of times we know when this tempting thought turns over into sin. We know that, and the line gets crossed pretty easily for us, but Jesus never crossed that line. Like, that was never a thing that happened for him. And so, again, I won't go too far into that because then we'd be here while Chris is speaking. So, verse 16, and this is probably the part where we'll talk the most on. Because he's in verse 16, the writer of Hebrews says, let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. And this is because we have a high priest who is divine and compassionate, we can come boldly to his throne. Now let's talk what boldly means. Boldly does not mean proudly, does not mean arrogantly, or presumptuous. Earlier in Hebrews, if you study it, you find the writer of Hebrews is criticizing the Israelites specifically for their presumptuous nature. They were rebelling against God, complaining, bellyaching, presuming that they'll be fine and God will just forgive them, thinking there won't be any consequences. And the specific Israelites in that moment that he's talking about, which is the ones that wandered the wilderness, they did face consequences for that. They were too presumptuous on who God was, that they weren't actually living like God is who he says he is. But boldly does mean we come constantly, without reservation. Boldly does mean we freely come And we don't need to come with fancy words or thinking there's a certain passphrase or certain design to it, but we come freely. And lastly, like the passage calls us, with confidence and with persistence. The enemy tries to discourage us from this. Now, this is where we're going to get into, do you actually trust God? Because even as Christians, sometimes we get nervous to bring our things before God. Or we sin and then we try to hide that from God, even though we know He sees everything. This is exactly the same thing that happened in the garden. And it's the enemy putting a seed of distrust in God. Because if we trust God and what He says, we would listen to verse 16 when it says, "Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." The question is whether, just like with the wheelbarrow, do we actually believe that? And do we live like that's true? Because, one, we can't get it anywhere else. The throne of grace is where we can receive mercy and find grace and help, to help in time of need. And we can't find it anywhere else. The throne of God is a throne of grace. When we come, we may obtain mercy and find grace in our time of need. And this is also recognizing that God's grace operates in the fulfillment of God's justice in light of the cross. And so do we actually believe this? Do we actually come to God whenever we are in need of mercy and grace? Because there are times when I'm talking with believers and it's like, I'm really struggling with this, or I'm really holding on to this. And I'm like, have you brought it to God? It's like, oh no, God doesn't want to deal with this. It's like, no, you're not believing who God said what He said when He said that we are to draw boldly to His throne. And this whole idea of like, if God is true, that means I should be able to trust God, and do I actually trust God? It boils down to sorry, I don't know why I pulled this up. We need to trust God's wisdom, as we find in Proverbs. So here, let me flip there real quick. You guys don't worry about flipping there. I'm just going to read a section of Proverbs. So I was speaking with someone the other day about how I try reading through Proverbs every so often, but because it's quite a long book, sometimes I'll be reading it and then I'm like, oh, this is such good wisdom for my life and fulfilling in my life. And then as I get further on, I'm just kind of tired out of it. And so I was talking with him, what's something you do to help you get through larger chunks of scripture? Because they were reading through Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is also good, but also he's very sad. And so if you're just reading through Jeremiah constantly, it could bog you down even a little bit. And so we both talked about how we actually like finding resources to split up the reading. So it's I read a chunk of Hebrews or Proverbs. They read a chunk of Jeremiah, and then they have a little supplementation book to help them take a break. And so every time I go back to Proverbs and I'm going through it, and they go back through Jeremiah and they're going through it, it's actually super enriching every time. So that's for free. That's just a little side note. So Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23 says, Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life. And James 4:4-8 says to seek God. And so basically, all these things, Proverbs constantly talks about, James constantly talks about, and it says trust God's wisdom. Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flows the spring of life. And the way this connects to what we've been talking about in Hebrews is the fact that if we believe God is true, and if we can trust Him, we should be listening to what He says. And so when He says to guard our heart, we should listen to what He says is how we guard our heart. And part of that is relying on Jesus as our high priest, so that we can have confidence to draw near His throne.
Well, it's the only place we can find real peace,
Yeah.
and it will calm our hearts and give us the feeling of security.
Yeah. When my talk at camp, because I did one of the breakout sessions, was building off of this, and what I really went into was how are we living life discerningly? Because if we really believe God is true, and if that we are to trust God, we should rely on Him for discernment. So whatever we do in life, it's like, I don't know, is this the right thing to do or not? I just go. I was telling the students, just come here. This is truth. Will tell you what's right and wrong. Even if it's not like the very specific scenario in life is written in here. Like, if it doesn't write, you should not hide your phone from your parents or whatever. I know that doesn't apply to you guys, but it applied to the youth students. But even though it doesn't directly say that, it has, like the book of Proverbs has a ton of things telling you how to live the godly life. And as a wise professor once told me, the law, or how he tells you to live, reflects the character of the lawgiver. And we are to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. So if we want to know who God is, we come here and see how He tells us to live. And we should reflect God's heart. And if we're honestly looking for God's heart, it'll help us discern those other things that we're not so sure about. Things that the Bible doesn't speak directly on. Like, for example, who should my friends be? Or who should I have around me as my community? One of the biggest things I challenged the students with at camp was think of who are the 5 closest people to you. Because whoever those 5 closest people are going to be who you're going to turn into. And are they people that point you to Christ? Do they have an eternal mindset like Christians should? Or do they not? Do they just want to waste their life away? And I was talking to students at the time, but I think it applies to all of us. Even if we're older and we're thinking, well, there's not much left that God has for me to do. There is. God's never done with us. There's always something to do.
That's right.
Yeah. And I believe it's in Philippians where Paul says, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain.
Yes.
That should be it's what I want my life to model. But
I'm thinking back when I was young, and now as I'm grown up, a mindset that interferes with all this is bitterness of heart or holding on to resentments.
mm-hmm.
And I think this is a big issue. If you're a teenager and something happens to you and you're holding on to a grudge, there's a possibility of a bitterness a root of bitterness,
Mhm.
which is discussed later in chapter 12 of Hebrews.
Yeah.
And that can really mess things up because you're blocking your access to God and God's grace to you because you're hanging on to something.
Mhm.
You're either murdering someone in your heart and holding on to that. So those are issues that a young person has to address or point out to them. Look, you got to let that go.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think it's really funny because a lot of times in those situations when we're holding on to something like bitterness, and it's like God is saying, come to me, I have something better for you. A lot of times it's like, well, no, I want this. It's like a selfish reason we're holding on to that bitterness a lot of times. It's
It's like I have a right to.
yeah, I have a right to be bitter about this because this person offended me. And it's like God comes and steps in the picture. It's like, yeah, well, I forgave you. And so you're called to forgive them. And in our finite mind, like in our world, it's like, no, I have this right to this. I want them to pay for hurting me in a way. But in reality, because, I mean, who would have thought God knows better? When we let go of that, we're able to flourish so much more.
But revenge is from the Lord, not from us.
Yeah. The revenge is the Lord's. So, yeah. All right. I don't know what time it is.
9:46.
Oh, I'm way short.
Well, you're still tall enough.
Yeah.
You know, John, as you're talking about this, I think about different analogies in the Bible as a roadmap of life.
Mm-hmm.
No matter where you go, you have not only directions, but you have specific directions.
Yeah.
And just like what you're saying about forgiveness, we all deal with that somewhere in life. And in our mind, as someone else is talking, it's like, well, it's easy for you to say. You know,
Yeah.
is it? I mean, because what we're really doing is say, well, that's you, that's not me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and we've all had it. I have it. You know, there's things pop up. You know, from a former marriage type of thing that you have to keep going back to. You know, remembering you forgave that person.
Yeah.
Because the devil wants to keep that up because that keeps, it's like saying keep the sand soft and moving.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the hardest things about forgiveness is that it costs something. And so sometimes even after you've forgiven someone, the cost comes back and you're like, it hurts. It's like, I don't like that. But like you said, you have to keep reminding yourself, but I forgave that person.
We were reading a little bit about Jonathan Goforth, and his freshman year, he's going to Knox College. He wants to complete a 4-year course in becoming a minister. But he's hazed by his freshman classmates when he first arrives. And I'm astonished because he's good-natured toward it. He forgives his classmates. He's holding a larger goal ahead of himself. And I myself how I would have reacted, I would have been out of there. But he was involved in mission work, and his classmates became so respectful of what he was doing, because he'd visit the red light area and ask folks, hey, come to church, or he'd visit the jail. Once a week, he would go out on some mission stuff while he's doing his studies. So he never had this resentment build up in him because of what his classmates did to him. So he forgave them, and they would come back to him and ask for forgiveness. I'm so, gee, we're sorry we did it. It was pretty bad, hazing.
Okay.
But his heart was amazing how he went through that and let it go, and he just rose to the higher purpose God had for him, and he became this great missionary to China.
Yeah. And if he didn't let go of that bitterness,
Oh, Yeah, he would have been out of there,
Yeah.
derailed his whole career.
Hmm.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No problem.
Vicky, do you have something to share with the class?
I guess you're critics.
Does he know where we're at?
Oh.
It's debating.
Here, now it's mine.
But on the other hand, while they were in China, they constantly had to approach the throne of grace because they needed God's help. I mean, they faced opposition, and in some cases, they had to pray while a mob was outside ready to storm their compound and kill them.
Hmm.
But they would pray, and the crowd would disperse. So they were constantly praying for help, confidently going to the throne of grace because they
Yeah.
needed that. And they were able to start churches all over the Honan province where there had never been the word spoken before. And so many received the gospel because they were called beforehand.
Yeah, and I think that paints a really good picture about what we've been talking about, because they were put in a situation where they had to trust and rely on God. They didn't have any other option.
That's right.
And so, actually, obviously, we know when you're put in a position where you have no other choice, it becomes easier because you have no other choice. And so it's like very, I shouldn't say easier, but it's more readily the option to go to. And I think a lot of times for us who live in an environment that isn't that, we sometimes forget that we also need the throne of grace every day. And that sometimes we should be willing to step out and put ourselves in situations where we might need to rely on God. I remember when we would take our trips down to Mexico, a lot of people thought we were crazy because we would just take 50 people in a caravan of cars all the way on a 3-day trip down to Mexico from Spokane. And a lot of times I was just like, that was the great part of it. Because half the time, when things would go wrong, we're just like, well, we have to rely on God now. Things will work out. And time again, it did. And he showed up. And it was probably one of my biggest lessons of like, if you would just step out and put yourself in a position where you need to rely on God, he will show up. Sometimes it takes us getting out of our own way to let God come in. That's why a lot of times I tell, especially students, don't be afraid to step out of your comfort zone. If you're going into something that's uncomfortable, good. If you're too comfortable, yeah.
When you're talking about that word boldness, and going with boldness, I've got a little note in my Bible. It's okay to read about
Yeah.
the word boldness. It says it's in the Greek word, I guess you pronounce it parousia, and it says, in addition to what you said about having freedom and not being afraid to do things, it denotes a divine enablement that comes to ordinary and unprofessional, spiritual people. It says that that kind of boldness is not a human quality, but a result of being filled with the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
It's not us that being afraid, that it's
Yeah.
God's help.
It's hard for us as humans to have boldness that is also not proudful and arrogant and stuff like that.
Jim Catlin led a group of young people. They had an acting troupe, and they would go visit churches and take a long drive. So they had all their stuff stored in a trailer and then another vehicle. And along the trip, a leaf spring broke on that trailer. Very unexpected. So they had to stop and figure out how to jury rig a quick repair. But here was something that went really wrong. So Jim he was the assistant pastor. He had to address the problem. And I think the example he gave to the students was great. Here's an unexpected thing. We'll work this out. You don't fly off the handle or get upset because your schedule's messed up or whatever. You just deal with this as it comes up. And I think the students with him really grew through that incident. Something went wrong, and God helped us through that.
Yeah.
They would visit churches in Utah and some other places, and they had a Christian skit that they had prepared. So it was a really fun excursion for those students. They loved that.
Yeah. Yeah. Road trips are a great time to rely on God. So.
He was teaching them. In fact, I remember listening to him give a class on how to play the guitar. A lot of these kids had to learn how to lead other students in singing. And they didn't know how to play a guitar, so they had a guitar lesson, and Jim was teaching them how to tune and how to play. And these kids were really into it. They learned how to do it because they knew they'd be on the spot helping the kids where they were visiting to sing some of these songs, and they would be leading. I'd never seen anything like that. It was really impressive, and all those kids were really into it, and they learned this.
Sounds very unique. I don't think I've heard of something like that recently. But
He was able to engage the students who were with him, so that they could become leaders in small groups and lead singing.
Yeah.
I'd never seen that before. He was amazing.
Yeah.
Fellow.
all right. We're close to 10, so unless anyone has any other questions, I'll pray and then we can go.
I apologize for my phone.
Oh.
But Tana's not feeling well
Yeah.
this morning, so he's gonna go ahead, Chris is gonna go ahead and bring Lily to church, so I'm gonna help Brady.
Oh, okay.
It just,
Yeah.
But I feel bad, they really have a load, those folks.
Yeah.
Would-
Yes, they do. So,
If we could pray for them.
yeah, we'll pray for them before we close. So, all right. I will open, and then one other person wanna pray for them. It'll just be two people praying. You'll want to pray? Okay.
Lord, I thank you for Chris and his family, and just especially think of them now as Tana's going through some health issues, and just that maybe that, Lord, you could help them with getting her feeling better. And with the children, there's so much to do, and especially with little Lily, and we just pray for Chris as he's got the load of the sermon today and the children. So I just pray for him and his calmness and peace as he goes to the pulpit.
Yeah, Lord, just want to ask that you be with Tana this morning and their family as they are juggling a bunch of stuff. Just ask that you'd give them peace, that this kids will be helpful towards Rainey, and that she's trying to manage them so Chris is not distracted while he's getting ready to share your word, God. So just be with them, give them calmness, peace, and be with Chris as he goes up there to share your word, and that his words be your words, and that it will be edifying to us all, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.